It's Halloween on Disney+. Watch frightful family favorites like Hocus Pocus and Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas on Disney+.
I am the Pumpkin King!
Then take the terror to 10 with a thrilling new remake of The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, Scream, and more with Halloween on Disney+. All these and more screaming this Halloween season with Hulu on Disney+. Bundle subscription required. 18+. Select Hulu content via Disney+. Additional content on Hulu app. Terms apply. Visit disneyplus.com/Hulu for details.
This episode is brought to you by Tic Tac. Your boss is going off at you for missing a deadline and you swear the clock just moved backwards. Suddenly, you remember the pack of Tic Tacs on your desk. Now you're riding horseback on the beach, the smell of citrus in the air. And what's this? Your boss is sitting behind you, breathing heavenly fresh mint? Refresh your mouth and mind and share your good vibes with Tic Tac.
This is True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time. Week by week, you'll hear the true stories behind the operations that have shaped the world we live in. You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position? I'm Rhiannon Needs, and this is True Spies from SPYSCAPE Studios. The story of the world is plotted out in unremarkable rooms. This particular room is in Germany. Within it sit 3 men. One of them, to all appearances an Englishman, produces a small atlas from his pocket. A second man, an Estonian by birth, takes the atlas from the first. His dark, intelligent eyes alight upon Russia. He moves to mark the page with his pencil, swinging it to and fro, drawing new borders. The third man, the Estonian's immediate superior, is an Austrian. He watches on and, as habit demands, orates at length for his audience of 2.
Well, look, what we're going to do is we're going to take on Russia, and we, Germany, are going to want Ukraine and the Caucasus because of Ukraine's minerals, and we're going to want the Caucasus, Azerbaijan, and the oil fields around Baku. And the British Empire can have, what they like east of Ukraine.
The year is 1932, and to anyone with an ounce of sense, a German invasion of Russia sounds like pure insanity. But in this room, and for these men, it's practically a done deal. So, who's who? The Austrian, as you've likely surmised, is an ascendant Adolf Hitler. We assume no further introduction is necessary. The Estonian, an ethnic German by birth, is Alfred Rosenberg. Now, that's a less familiar name, but you'll certainly know his work. He's a self-styled philosopher who, throughout the many ups and downs of the 1920s, has been one of Hitler's closest confidants. Today, he's remembered as one of the main architects of the Nazis' racial ideology. So then, to the third man, that unlikely Britisher at this meeting of fevered Teutonic minds. Him you won't have heard of, but you really ought to have.
Well, I was leafing through Professor Keith Jeffrey's monumental book called MI6, which was produced for the centenary of the service. And I came across 6 pages which referred to a character called Baron Wilhelm De Ropp, and it said that he produced 70% of the political intelligence on Nazi Germany. And I thought to myself, that is an astonishing percentage. And how could a person who had produced so much of intelligence on Nazi Germany only warrant 6 pages in a book that is 840 pages long?
How indeed? Let's find out. This is True Spies, the Baltic Baron.
My name's Tim Willasey-Wilsey. I'm a visiting professor at King's College London. I'm also a senior associate fellow at RUSI, the defence think tank, and for 27 years I was a British diplomat serving overseas on 4 continents.
Tim Willasey-Wilsey is your guide to the incredible story of Baron Wilhelm de Ropp, Britain's spy inside Hitler's inner circle. Interestingly enough, he wasn't actually British at all.
He really was Wilhelm von De Ropp, was born to a Baltic German family in the north of Lithuania. Now, in those days, Lithuania was part of Tsarist Russia. So, although it was a German settler family living on a large estate in Lithuania, they were actually Russian nationals.
Growing up, young Wilhelm learned German and Russian fluently. You can imagine how that might have come in useful later on. At the time, though, not so much.
It was a difficult time to be a Baltic German because the Russians never really trusted you because you were German. The Germans never trusted you because you were Russian. The Lithuanians wanted you out because you were a colonial settler class. And the nearby Poles didn't like you because you were Protestant and not Catholic. So you really felt unwanted. All his big sisters went off and married German aristocrats. And that left him really on his own at home with his mother.
When his mother passed away, Wilhelm found his way to England.
He went for a short while to Birmingham University in the UK to study as an electrical engineer. And on holiday in France that summer, he met a British girl and they decided to go to Australia and they got married in Australia.
This, by the way, outraged his new wife's prim and proper family.
And after 6 months in Tasmania, they come back to England, to the county of Wiltshire, and have a sort of year or 2 years rather unsatisfactory. She was a well-connected county girl. She was always sort of opening fetes or playing at tennis matches or involved in amateur dramatics. And Wilhelm, or William as he increasingly became, felt a little bit out of place.
Fortunately for this drifting son of obscure European nobility, his purpose would find him soon enough. In 1914, to be exact.
So for him, the great moment really was when the First World War broke out. That was the moment he sort of found a meaning to his life. So he applied to join the army. He was refused because he was Russian. He applied for British nationality and had to get a statement that he was not German, that he was Russian, which the Russian consulate produced for him. And he became a British national in an incredibly quick time, in about 3 or 4 weeks. And he joined the Wiltshire Regiment at the start of World War I. And so began, now with a changed name, De Ropp rather than Von De Ropp, made it sound less German. And he was very much William or Bill rather than Wilhelm.
This transformation was utterly comprehensive. In idle conversation, you'd never have known where Bill De Ropp was really from.
He did something which is quite astonishing, which he spoke 4 languages to native level. In other words, he could pass as a national of Britain, France, Germany and Russia. Now, I don't know many people who can do that in 2 languages, let alone in 4. So he became a quintessential British Army officer and completely passed as such.
Officer or not, Bill De Ropp would not escape the horrors of the Great War.
He had a horrendous First World War, as of course everybody did. He volunteered to join the Royal Flying Corps from the Wiltshire Regiment. That was quite lucky, actually, because his particular battalion of the Wiltshire Regiment was almost wiped out in Gallipoli. So he joined the Royal Flying Corps, and instead of being sent to fly aeroplanes, he was sent to man a observation balloon over the Western Front.
Now, there are balloons, and there are balloons. One sort is flown by wealthy people of leisure. Bill De Ropp's was the other kind.
Now, these balloons, they were called kite balloons, were tethered about a mile behind the lines at about 5,000 feet.
Picture a thinned tube attached to the ground with a thick steel rope.
And you were up there with a pair of binoculars and a field telephone, and you were looking for German targets for our artillery to shoot at. So you'd find a target from the flash of the gun, you'd work out the coordinates, you'd send it to our artillery units, and our artillery units would take out the German gun.
So far, so good.
The problem with it was an extremely dangerous job because German fighter aircraft deliberately went after these balloons. First of all, they started shooting down the balloons, which were very, very easy to shoot down. And that gave a real dilemma to the occupants of the basket, because you either jumped out with your Spencer parachute, which was a very basic parachute, and if you were lucky, your parachute opened before you hit the ground, or you waited for the guys to winch you down using a winch, which took rather a long time. Either way, you were really quite likely to die.
Fortunately for Bill, his stint in the air was short enough.
He did 6 months, I think, in observation balloons. He developed very severe conjunctivitis in his eyes, and he had to go back to UK for treatment.
Now grounded, Bill's gift for languages was attracting attention.
He was spotted by Lord Northcliffe's propaganda team.
Lord Northcliffe was a media baron who, by the late 1910s, controlled almost half of the UK's weekly newspaper circulation. He was made Director of Propaganda in Foreign Countries in the final years of the Great War. Of Bill De Ropp, Northcliffe thought,
well, hang on a moment, here's a guy with amazing linguistic abilities. We could be using better use of him. So he's brought into the whole propaganda setup in London, which was rather late getting going, but by 1917 and 1918 was well underway.
Bill stayed with Northcliffe's department until 1919. Operating in both England and Germany, he milked prisoners of war for information that could be weaponized as demoralizing missives to the enemy. During his service, he would have come into contact with members of a relatively recent addition to the British intelligence community.
MI6, whose real name is the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, but is commonly known as MI6, had a stellar reputation. It was regarded as the absolutely supreme intelligence service.
While MI6 had earned its stellar reputation during wartime, its momentum flagged after Armistice Day.
After the war, most of the talented people had left and gone off and done other things, and the money dried up, so it became a very small service. It really was struggling, and it really dealt with small-time information, tactical information on a communist visiting the UK from Holland on one day, and then maybe the next day it would be about a Czech munitions worker who was coming into the UK from Sweden.
It was this MI6 that Bill De Ropp tapped up for a job when his propaganda department was rolled up.
He got in touch with Stuart Mingus, Colonel Stuart Mingus, who was a senior MI6 officer and later would become the third chief of MI6. And he said, look, do you have a job for me? And Mingus, of course, knowing Bill's linguistic abilities, just leapt at the chance.
Stuart Mingus knew just what to do with Bill. At a time when the newly formed Soviet Union had its sights set on Eastern Europe, De Ropp's Russian-speaking Lithuanian background was a great asset.
In 1919, he sent to the Baltics, where there was this impossibly complicated situation in which there were 7 or 8 different armed groups operating. For example, you had the defeated German troops who were allowed by the British to keep their weapons because the British wanted to keep the Soviet Bolsheviks out of the Baltic states. You also had, of course, the Bolsheviks, both the Soviet ones and the Baltic ones there. You had the White Russians, who, of course, were fighting against Soviet Russia. And you had Lithuanian and other independence movements as well. So this really was a sort of spaghetti soup of complexity. And it needed somebody of Bill's knowledge of the Baltics, but also his linguistic skills to help navigate this.
Undercover as a journalist for the Daily Mail newspaper, a legend kindly provided by the aforementioned Lord Northcliffe, Bill's intelligence gathering in the Baltics contributed towards major British successes in the region. One of them involved foiling a coup put in motion by his own brother. But that's a story for another time.
It was actually a remarkable British diplomatic success because after 1919 there was no appetite to deploy troops overseas. Britain, and it was Britain, managed to ensure that neither the Germans nor the Russians dominated the Baltic states.
But Bill's time in the Baltics wasn't without incident. In fact, Tim Willasey-Wilsey believes that he was party to a scandal, one that would rock British politics to its core.
As a contractor, I don't pay for materials I don't use. So why would I pay for stuff I don't need in my mobile plan? That's why the new MyBiz plan from Verizon Business is so perfect. Now I can choose exactly what I want, and I only pay for what I need.
Right now, with MyBiz plan, get our best price, as low as $25 a line. Visit Verizon.com/business to get started today. New lines only. Price per month with 5+ lines. Includes auto pay and paper-free billing and promotional discount. Taxes, fees, economic adjustment charge. Applicable add-ons, prices, and terms apply. Guarantee applies to base monthly rate and stated discounts only. Add-on prices additional. Offers end September 30th, 2025.
Well, the Zinoviev letter was a massive scandal, and in fact was still even regarded as a scandal by the Wilson and Blair governments when they came to power, almost in the case of Blair, 80 years later.
The Zinoviev letter refers to a letter published in, you guessed it, the Daily Mail in October 1924.
Which purported to be a message from the Soviet Comintern, the Communist International, to the Communist Party of Great Britain, urging dissent amongst British armed forces, is said to have caused the Labour government of James Ramsay MacDonald to lose the October 1924 election.
In the many years since its publication, the Zinoviev letter has been revealed as a forgery. While it's named for Grigory Zinoviev, then the chairman of the Communist International, he had nothing to do with it. Someone had put him in the frame.
It is now widely asserted that this was a sort of MI6 conspiracy against the Labour government.
An intelligence agency moving against its own government. It's the stuff of deep state nightmares. But where does Bill De Ropp come into it?
This actually came as a byproduct of my research into Bill De Ropp. I wasn't looking for any connection to the Zinoviev letter at all. But when I was reading some of the more authoritative writings on the Zinoviev letter, it all came down to this character who goes to Riga in late September, early October 1924, and goes to the forger, who was a man called Pokrovsky. And he approaches Pokrovsky in the name of a General Korniev of the White Russian Army and commissions the letter.
The White Russians were the defeated side in the Russian Revolution and spent many years thereafter resisting and undermining international communism. General Korniev took the forged letter to the MI6 station in Riga, the Latvian capital. But according to the records, he did so under a different guise entirely. Captain Black of MI6.
So I was thinking to myself, gosh, how many people would MI6 have had who could pose as a White Russian general and also as a captain in the British Armed Forces, if you like? Well, Bill De Ropp had been a captain in the Royal Flying Corps, which later became the Royal Air Force. He also had perfect Russian, and there were plenty of White Russian generals in their late 30s, early 40s. And it then occurred to me, hang on a moment, there's a possibility that General Korniev and Captain Black is in fact Bill De Ropp.
Tim has spent years gathering proof.
When I looked at his travels, I noticed that Bill De Ropp set off for Mombasa in Kenya on the 8th of October 1924. So on the day that the Zinoviev letter arrived in London, Bill De Ropp, set off for Kenya.
The plotters behind the Zinoviev letter had to assume that the very capable Russian intelligence services would eventually get to the bottom of the whole sorry affair.
Now, bearing in mind, MI6 was only a service of about 50 people. Only about 20 of those were proper intelligence officers. They probably had a few dozen agents, but they wouldn't have had many agents who could pass off themselves as a Russian, who could go to the Baltic states and pass off as those two identities.
MI6 believed that Bill De Ropp's cover in the Baltics was likely blown. They needed to get him out of the picture, laying low in Mombasa.
And so that was really the conclusive evidence. I've spoken to Jill Bennett, who is the absolute expert on the Zinoviev letter and has written 2 books on the subject. And she agrees that Bill De Ropp was indeed General Korniev and Captain Black.
Tim is the first person to put Bill De Ropp at the heart of this sordid little episode. But he's also learned something else, namely that there might have been no great conspiracy at all.
Well, MI6 were not trying to sabotage the Labour government in the October 1924 elections. What they were trying to do was drive a wedge between the Comintern, the Communist Party of Great Britain, and the British Labour Party. And they actually did this at the behest of the Labour Home Secretary, Arthur Henderson. And there is a letter in the National Archives in which Arthur Henderson says, look, we've got to try and find some evidence that sabotages this connection between the Comintern and the CPGB, the Communist Party of Great Britain. And of course, MI6 are sent off to find the evidence. And they come to the conclusion, perfectly reasonably, that rather than use a real letter, which would endanger a real source, the better thing to do is to forge a letter. So they forge a letter, and Bill De Ropp commissions it. It arrives in London, and then I think the mistake is made.
It just so happens that, as the letter arrives, the Labour Party have called an election.
And MI6, instead of aborting the whole operation, which is what they should have done, decide it would be too much trouble to set the whole thing up again and let the operation run. And of course, as a result, it actually impacts more on the Labour government and its chances of electoral success than it does on the Comintern. So this actually is a classic case, not of conspiracy, but of mission creep.
Not that De Ropp or MI6 would have been too disappointed to see the left-wing Labour Party take an electoral kicking.
Mingis, Bill De Ropp, these were all centre-right conservatives. There was a great deal of suspicion of Labour, and I don't think anybody worried about it. I think nowadays, looking back on it, it looks like a shameful intervention in the democratic process.
Still, never attribute to malice what can be attributed to human error. The ancient port city of Mombasa, on the Kenyan coast, is a place of immense natural beauty. From Bill De Ropp's perspective, it was also a long way from the action. After 6 months, the Baron returned to England, but not for long. In the middle of the 1920s, De Ropp decamped to Berlin, whose nighttime hedonism belied a nihilism born of economic instability and wounded national pride. We know now where that led. But Germany, so recently defeated, was not considered a threat.
Don't forget, MI6 was working against the Russians, not the Germans. So he went off to Berlin, and he was paid 10 quid here and 20 quid there for the odd piece of intelligence. But he was now a jobbing intelligence agent. He was no longer a salaried intelligence agent.
In 1926, Bill began taking on occasional work in Berlin for the Bristol Aeroplane Company, a British plane manufacturer. It's likely that his intelligence connections got him the job. This was a time when the German aviation industry was being scrutinized, largely for its interactions with the Soviet Union. It was worth having someone like De Ropp, who'd studied engineering and spoke fluent German, in that arena.
So he gets more and more interested in the covert contact between the Berlin government and the Soviets, which we all now know about, the Treaty of Rapallo in 1922, and the covert training of the Luftwaffe with Russian help. He gets very involved in this, and gradually, MI6 start to get interested in this reporting and realize actually this is very significant stuff.
At the same time, he was writing pieces for British newspapers. As a journalist, he couldn't help but notice an unnerving trend unfolding in Germany's political life.
Certainly in the late 20s, Hitler was regarded as a hopeless case. If you remember, he had been arrested in Munich, he'd been thrown into prison. He was regarded more and more as a fringe character. But Bill De Ropp reckoned that Hitler had something. He had some sort of staying power. And I think he put his money on Hitler.
Which isn't to say he liked the man.
He was never pro-Nazi. He was always, and actually he even used to say to the Nazis that he had been a supporter of Brüning and Treviranus, the sort of centre-right Weimar-era politicians.
Nonetheless, by the end of the decade, it was clear to those in the know that Adolf Hitler's band of street thugs were making gains.
So I think it was in 1930, really, that MI6 thought, hang on a moment, we actually need some serious reporting on Germany and the rise of the Nazi Party. And it was in 1930, 1931 that Bill De Ropp was put back onto a salary.
And so Baron William De Ropp began his infiltration of the Nazi Party. And the way he did it is a masterclass in human intelligence gathering.
Long-term penetration of a hostile nation-state requires masses of patience. You've got to play it long. You can't ask obvious questions, and you can't ask to be put in touch with the person who you know has got better access. So the way he played it, whether this was a natural caution or just a testament to his skill as a secret agent, he actually resisted the pushing of his case officers and took it very gently.
So gentle, in fact, that his first port of call wasn't even a proper Nazi.
Bill De Ropp had a number of friends amongst the German Baltic aristocracy. And there was a particular Baron von Medem there who was involved with an organization called the Steel Helmets, the Stahlhelm.
The Steel Helmets were an ultra-nationalist organization made up of ex-soldiers. It grew in parallel to the Nazis and shared many of their values, a key difference being that they were in favor of a return to monarchist rule.
And I think Bill, having served in the First World War himself, had a degree of sympathy with the German war veterans, most of whom were unemployed. It was von Medem who said to him, look, I think, Bill, you'd be very interested to meet a real stormtrooper.
Von Medem introduced Bill to a friend, a member of the SA, the Nazis' paramilitary arm. His name was Hans Berthold,
who had another connection with Bill De Ropp. Berthold had served in southern Africa, so they had an African connection as well. And after knowing Berthold for a number of months, and Berthold produced some very good intelligence.
Now, Bill is on the ladder to the top of the party, albeit on a very low rung.
Berthold suddenly said, Bill, I think you need to meet my boss. And his boss was a real serious Nazi called Arno Schickedanz.
Schickedanz was the Berlin correspondent for the main Nazi newspaper, and therefore a man with intimate links to the party apparatus.
So Bill is introduced to Arno Schickedanz, and again, he takes Schickedanz out for rather expensive meals in the restaurants on the Kurfürstendamm in Berlin, and they get to know each other for a number of months.
Until the inevitable.
And Arno Schickedanz suddenly says to Bill De Ropp one day, hang on a moment, he said, I think the guy you'd really like to meet is my boss, who is the Nazi ideologist Alfred Rosenberg. And Schickedanz takes him to meet Rosenberg at the railway station where Rosenberg is just traveling to Munich. And as you can imagine in a railway station, the meeting doesn't go particularly well. But fortunately, when Rosenberg gets back from Munich, he calls up Bill De Ropp and they have a much more substantial session. And they come to get on extraordinarily well.
We met Rosenberg briefly at the beginning of this episode, carving up Eastern Europe on Bill De Ropp's pocket atlas.
Rosenberg is undoubtedly a member of Hitler's inner circle, is in the inner 10 or 12 around Hitler. But he's also a bit of an oddball and not taken entirely seriously by the rest of the Nazi leadership.
That's a good thing, really. The friends of bigger beasts, say a Goebbels or a Himmler, would be under far greater scrutiny. Rosenberg's also a German Bolt, something he has in common with Bill.
I think the fact that Rosenberg is from Estonia gives them a certain sort of commonality, although Rosenberg is the first to admit that Bill is actually really a Prussian aristocrat. But also, they were both intellectuals. They liked talking about Nietzsche, although Bill De Ropp describes Rosenberg as a muddle-headed philosopher. Nonetheless, Rosenberg liked to talk about intellectual things, as indeed did Bill De Ropp. And of course, not many Nazis could do that sort of thing.
In the space of a single year, Bill De Ropp had climbed very near to the top of the tree. And he wasn't done yet. Not by a long way.
I describe these as crab-like movements because he moves from von Medem to Berthold, from Berthold to Schickedanz, from Schickedanz to Rosenberg, never through the front door, always by getting them to invite him. And the ultimate crab-like maneuver is his introduction to Hitler.
It's 1931, and Bill De Ropp is about to meet one of history's greatest monsters.
He says to Rosenberg one day, by the way, I'm going down skiing. I'm going down to doing winter sports with my wife to Garmisch near Munich. And Rosenberg says, well, while you're down there, why don't you meet my boss, Adolf Hitler? And Bill says, oh, well, that's a nice idea. So they go down to Garmisch, and then from Garmisch he takes the train into Munich, and he meets Hitler in Rosenberg's office.
Everything has been leading up to this moment. The three men settle into their conversation. Like any good HUMINT operative, Bill De Ropp has excellent interpersonal skills. He can walk with kings and keep the common touch. But Adolf Hitler is a Gordian knot of neuroses, too tightly wound for the Baron's charm to penetrate.
The meeting goes incredibly badly. First thing is Bill De Ropp chain smokes through the meeting, and Hitler hates cigarette smoke. He actually defends the Jews and their work for the British and German armed forces in the First World War. That sends Hitler off on a complete rant. And the meeting goes so badly, he thinks that's the end of it. In fact, I think he must have been worried that he'd completely destroyed his chances even with Rosenberg.
But luck, or at least curiosity, is on his side.
A couple of days later, Rosenberg gets in touch and says, actually, Adolf Hitler would like to see you again. And this time he travels back into Munich, and this time he gets it right. He doesn't smoke, and he portrays himself as not pro-Nazi, but sympathetic to Germany and Germany's plight. And this does the trick. And at the end of the meeting, Hitler says, I'd really like to consult you from time to time on, how my policies are going down in London. And that's how he gets in with Adolf Hitler himself.
So began a series of intimate meetings with the would-be Führer. You heard the details of one of them at the beginning of this episode. De Ropp never became what you'd call a personal friend of Hitler, but his relationship with Rosenberg continued to deepen throughout 1931.
Bill De Ropp has the idea of inviting Rosenberg to London. At this time, Rosenberg looks like a shoo-in to be the Nazi foreign minister. There are only two Nazis with a sort of international outlook. One was Hess, Rudolf Hess, who had been born in British-controlled Alexandria in Egypt. And the other one was Rosenberg, who was Estonian, who had spent some time in Paris and in Russia. It looked as if he was going to be foreign minister. So the idea was to take him to London, and MI6 would set him up with a program to meet sort of influential Brits. This is cleared by MI6 with the Foreign Office.
An MI6 officer named Frederick Winterbottom organises Rosenberg's visit.
He introduces Rosenberg to a number of senior British academics, politicians, journalists, and the meeting goes extraordinarily well, and Rosenberg returns with a tremendously positive view, both of Winterbottom and of Bill De Ropp, who of course idea it had all been.
It's no surprise then that Rosenberg is keen to compensate Bill for his seamless introduction to Britain's great and good.
Bill De Ropp says to MI6 that he's getting paid by Rosenberg to be his representative on British affairs. Rosenberg has a similar representative who handles US affairs, so these are people who advise him on those countries.
In January 1933, De Ropp's bet on the Nazis paid out again. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor, in a government still densely populated by old-school aristocrats, who thought the little corporal could be controlled. 3 months later, Hitler appointed one such aristocrat as German foreign minister. Naturally, this left Alfred Rosenberg, who'd been eyeing the job for years, bitterly disappointed. As a consolation prize, Hitler made him head of the Nazi Party's internal foreign office. And it was in this capacity that Rosenberg made his second visit to London in May 1933. This time, things didn't run quite so smoothly.
And already the Nazis have done a number of things which have appalled the British population and the political class, including some early moves against the Jewish population. So he has a number of meetings in London which go extremely badly. But the real moment, the horror moment for Rosenberg, is when he thinks it's a good idea to lay a wreath at the Cenotaph in Whitehall. And on the wreath there is the Nazi swastika. And a passing member of the public picks it up, walks the 150 yards or whatever to the Thames and throws it into the Thames. And this gets a lot of publicity. And Rosenberg is really vilified and has to take an early shower. He has to leave London early on an early train and go back.
Rosenberg was utterly humiliated. Any chance he'd had at the foreign minister's job was in ruins. Nonetheless, a month later, he was one of only 16 Nazis to be honoured with the rank of Reichsleiter, one rung below Hitler in the party hierarchy. Bill's intel was still one of a kind.
Bill De Ropp would have sent back several hundred reports to MI6 headquarters. The sad fact is I've only been able to find 24 in the National Archives, and I deem myself very lucky to have found 24, because the rules in those days were that all intelligence reports had to be returned to MI6 headquarters, where they were destroyed.
One surviving report details a truly extraordinary lunch meeting. In the spring of 1934, Alfred Rosenberg invited Frederick Winterbottom to Berlin. Winterbottom, you'll recall, was one of Bill De Ropp's MI6 handlers. He had facilitated Rosenberg's own trips to London back in 1931 and 33. Disastrous as his last visit to the British capital had been, Rosenberg didn't blame Winterbottom, whom he believed was a simple Air Ministry official. Remember, Germany still believed that Britain could be an ally in any future conflict. Maintaining friendly relations was a priority. And with Bill De Ropp there to grease the wheels, anything was possible. Winterbottom arrived in late February. Soon, he too came face to face with Hitler. After enduring a rant about communism, Winterbottom received the Führer's blessing to meet with his military staff and discuss foreign policy.
Hitler had said to Winterbottom, "Look, I'll ask one of my generals to brief you on my views on the Soviet Union." So this lunch was set up. Bill De Ropp was there, of course. Winterbottom was there. General von Reichenau, who was the most pro-Nazi of the Wehrmacht generals, then goes ahead and astonishingly briefs De Ropp and Winterbottom on what would later become Operation Barbarossa, but 7 years later. And in fact, the plan he describes, the three army groups moving through the Soviet Union, one to the south to go to the Caucasus oil fields, one to the center to go to Moscow, and one to the left to go up to Leningrad, was exactly what happened. And of course, they used the techniques developed by Guderian of using armored divisions, panzer divisions, to blast through Russian defenses and go at speed and be reinforced by aviation. And of course, this was really the early ideas behind Blitzkrieg.
It's shocking to hear just how many of the Nazis' future atrocities were planned out, step by step, years in advance. A few months after that luncheon, those who still refused to take Hitler seriously were dealt a devastating reality check. Bill De Ropp would not be among them.
He predicted that Hitler was going to be Chancellor on the death of Hindenburg, that he would take over, in a sense, both roles, Chancellor and President, and become the supreme leader, the Führer that he became. So he sees that. I'm not entirely clear to what degree he saw in advance the night of the long knives.
The 2nd of July, 1934. The night of the long knives. SS and Gestapo officers move against their rivals in the paramilitary SA, led by Ernst Röhm. Once a member of Hitler's inner circle, Röhm and many of his followers are killed.
As it happened, this may have been luck. Bill De Ropp was in London at the Hendon Air Show with a number of German visitors when the Night of the Long Knives happens, and a number of his friends are moved against. So this was a scary moment for Bill De Ropp.
Competent as he undoubtedly was, Bill was vulnerable.
I think the cover that he had adopted, was pretty wafer thin, really. After all, he was hiding in plain sight. I mean, he had fought for the British in the First World War. He never tried to hide that. It would have been ridiculous to hide it. He'd been in British uniform in Berlin in 1919, and he was still a British citizen. And yet here he was, a friend of one of the Nazi leaders, and that gave him a certain amount of protection against. Even Rosenberg was senior enough for the Abwehr or the Gestapo to think twice before questioning one of Rosenberg's close friends. But one of Rosenberg's other close friends, Kurt Lüdecker, does fall under suspicion. And I think this makes Bill think this actually could end badly. So he goes to the MI6 doctor and he asks for cyanide pills. And he's provided with cyanide pills, and he sews one into the ticket pocket in all his waistcoats. So he's got a cyanide pill with him at all times.
Desperate times call for desperate measures. And as the Nazis' grip tightened throughout the 1930s, there would be moments in which Bill De Ropp felt the weight of that little pill like an anvil. Nonetheless, he kept up his essential work, His salary alone tells you how valuable he was to his MI6 handlers.
So he was on £1,000 a year for much of his career, for a good 15 years of his career, which was probably, I think, the biggest salary being paid to any MI6 agent. It also had a negative aspect as well. It put him under a great deal of pressure. The whole time, MI6 headquarters was saying, are we getting value out of Bill De Ropp? And, he was constantly being pushed for more and more.
By 1937, Anglo-German relations were becoming ever more strained. Still, Bill De Ropp remained in Berlin. He was a part of the furniture around Alfred Rosenberg and a yearly attendee of Hitler's rallies at Nuremberg. If anyone could keep working under these conditions, it was him. But everyone could feel it. Time was running short.
Of course, there must have been some suspicion beginning to attach to Bill De Ropp. And then suddenly, Bill De Ropp produces another string to his bow, and I think was probably one of the biggest espionage coups of his career. The idea arises of getting the Nazis to invite a British aviation engineer to look at the German aircraft factories.
Remember, Bill studied engineering. He's also the German representative for the Bristol Aeroplane Company, a firm he's worked with since the mid-20s. But really, convince the Nazis to invite a foreign engineer to check out their most valuable kit? He's good, but is he that good? Well, think about it. There is a precedent here. Charles Lindbergh, the great American aviator, was invited to tour German aeroplane factories in 1936.
And indeed, Lindbergh goes back to FDR, Roosevelt in the United States, and says, we must never take on the Nazis.
The Nazis speak a language of intimidation. Bill knows that he can use that.
They think that by showing this aviation engineer and Bill De Ropp over the aircraft factories, they could spook Britain as well. So this engineer, Roy Fedden, who would later become Sir Roy Fedden, was the chief engineer at Bristol Aeroplane Company. Bill De Ropp had known him for years. Bill De Ropp arranges with the Nazis to go to all these major factories, Focke-Wulf, BMW, Messerschmitt, Heinkel. And they go around these factories 3 times, twice in 1937 and once in 1938.
But the Nazis have made a grave miscalculation.
Roy Fedden is such a skilled engineer that he can judge by just watching manufacturing take place. He can make all sorts of intelligent judgments. So he goes back to his hotel in the evening and he scribbles down what he has seen. And either in his hotel in Berlin or back in London, he then produces these remarkable graphs which have survived in the Imperial War Museum, in which he calculates the power of, for example, the BMW 601 engine or the Jumo 207 engine. These are the engines that are going to power the Messerschmitts and the Heinkels in the Second World War. And he makes judgments about their power-to-weight ratio and so forth, and is able then to compare them with the Merlin engine being produced by Rolls-Royce. And he calculates that at 4,000 feet, the Rolls-Royce Merlin still outperforms the Jumo.
Unbeknownst to the Nazis, the plan they've been allowed to believe was their own has backfired horrifically.
The historian of British intelligence in the Second World War, F.H. Hinsley, says that these visits to these aviation factories were extremely important in reassuring Britain that our engine manufacture was on course. And of course, ultimately, these were minute differences in performance that would allow the Spitfire to outperform Nazi aircraft during the Battle of Britain.
If Britain had lost that battle, or had been too scared to fight it, their war would likely have been over by 1941. Bill De Ropp helped to avert that hideous alternate history.
So, it doesn't get a lot more impressive than that.
Are your business expenses playing hide and seek? With Uber for Business, the small spends that slip through the cracks, like rides and meals, go right where you need them. Because it integrates with leading expense platforms, you can say goodbye to surprise costs, missing dollars, or chasing receipts. Everything's track downable. Uber for Business. Make small steps that make a big impact. Learn more at uber.com/small steps.
Shaq here, spinning fast-acting pain relief with Icy Hot. Ice works fast, heat makes it last. Icy Hot, you're so back.
By the time of Roy Fedden's last visit to Germany in 1938, war is a distinct possibility. In London, Bill's superiors are scrambling to prepare for the oncoming storm. In his office, Alexander Cadogan, permanent Undersecretary of the British Foreign Office, pens 4 letters.
So he writes to 4 Foreign Office colleagues and says, can you tell me, what should we do? And then he has this sort of idea, and you can almost sense his mind working, to send a 5th request to the head of MI6, Admiral Sinclair.
These days, the idea that a Foreign Office bigwig might not consult his intelligence service is laughable. But remember, this is a much diminished MI6. Its reputation is not what it was, nor what it will become.
A purveyor of low-level tittle-tattle, not a geopolitical provider of foreign policy advice. In fact, the Foreign Office were very protective that only they could do high-level foreign policy making. So this was a really big moment. He did it because he liked Admiral Sinclair, and he had been impressed by the reporting he'd been seeing, some of which, of course, had come from Bill De Ropp.
MI6 Chief Hugh Sinclair leaps at the opportunity to prove the service's worth.
He summons his political deputy back from France, where he's on holiday, to draft the report. And as it happens, Bill De Ropp, having just visited all these aviation factories, is in London as well.
Together, the men draft a document. Its title cuts straight to the chase.
What Should We Do is the name of the document which MI6 sent to Cadogan. They sent it to him in a very short time.
The document drew on Bill De Ropp's expertise to give a frank assessment of Germany's strengths and weaknesses.
What Should We Do, as a paper, could not have been produced without Bill De Ropp. He was the supplier of 70% of the political intelligence on Nazi Germany. And in What Should We Do, you can see his input because the constant references to Rosenberg.
It's a ruthlessly pragmatic paper, which suggests that Hitler be allowed to annex the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. This, in theory, would keep him busy enough for Britain to begin aggressively preparing for a full-scale conflict. On the 30th of September 1938, British PM Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich, met with Adolf Hitler, and made that deal.
We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our 2 peoples never to go to war with one another again.
A year later, Poland falls. A British national, even one as well connected as Bill De Ropp, would be crazy to stay in Berlin. He crosses the border to Switzerland.
Must have been a very nervous moment because, he was under suspicion. He could easily have been stopped at the Swiss border and arrested. So he was very anxious about it. But I think Rosenberg must have probably provided some form of support. And there is a strong suggestion that Heydrich also provided a laissez-passer to all the remaining journalists in Berlin, of which, of course, Bill De Ropp was still theoretically at least one. So he gets successfully into Switzerland. And Rosenberg is pleased by this. Rosenberg thinks, well, at least we've still got a channel that we can use to the British in Switzerland.
Britain, likewise, is pleased to have a back door into the Nazi regime.
So all sorts of feelers are put out in 1939, even after the declaration of war, to try and avoid the war itself. And Bill De Ropp is just one of several channels they use to communicate with the Nazis.
The Nazis' most fervent hope is that Winston Churchill, who always opposed appeasement, does not enter Downing Street.
And that a deal can still be done with Chamberlain. But as it becomes increasingly apparent that actually Churchill is going to become Prime Minister, and then, of course, he does become Prime Minister, the chances of some sort of deal look increasingly slim.
Meanwhile, tongues are wagging about Bill De Ropp.
I think already Bill De Ropp's cover was getting pretty threadbare before he left Germany. After he left Germany, of course, it was clear as anything, really. I mean, to a lot of his previous sources, like General von Epp and General von Reichenau, they would have asked, well, why did he escape to Switzerland if he's pro-German? and pro-us, why didn't he stay in Germany? So the very fact that he went to Switzerland must have warned off a lot of his former Nazi sources.
Finally, in 1940, Alfred Rosenberg sends his final message to Bill De Ropp in Switzerland.
Rosenberg says, look, only contact us again if there's going to be heavy snow, i.e., if there is a real chance of success, but otherwise don't bother. But until that point, it's very interesting in the correspondence with Rosenberg. Rosenberg is sending Bill De Ropp's views directly to Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler is actually saying on occasion, look, if Bill wants to come to Berlin, I will see him and I will welcome him. Very interesting confirmation, by the way, of how seriously Adolf Hitler took Bill De Ropp, even late 1939, early 1940.
Of course, Rosenberg isn't Bill's only source. He kept working for the British Secret Service until the end of the war. Turbulent years for this most accomplished of agents.
A new deputy head of the service comes into play, a man called Claude Dancy.
Dancy is a surprising choice for the role. In his late 60s, he's a long way past fighting age. On a personal level, he's difficult.
One of the people whose memoirs still exist in the Bodleian Library describes him as the only truly wicked man I ever met. He's a man of violent likes and dislikes. And from a very early stage, he takes a violent dislike to Bill De Ropp.
It's unlikely that Dancy ever met De Ropp. But the Baron's style of reporting, subtle, political, is a source of frustration for the older man.
So the sort of stuff that Bill De Ropp has been providing for 10 years about Goebbels in the ascendancy, now Goering's in the ascendancy, now Bormann's not, all that sort of political stuff, Dancy really doesn't like.
It doesn't help that Bill is also a favourite of Dancy's boss, Stuart Mingus, now the chief of MI6.
Dancy can't stand Mingus. There's a sort of real hostility between the two of them, a real sort of rivalry between the two of them. And in doing down De Ropp, Dancy thinks he's doing down Mingus. So the Dancy-Mingus rivalry makes life very uncomfortable for the 5 years that Bill De Ropp is essentially trapped in Switzerland.
Despite the growing friction between Bill and his MI6 handlers, he soldiers on.
There's one particular report that has survived, which is to do with the early months of Operation Barbarossa. It's a very good report because it's actually one of the very first reports which demonstrate that the Germans are in trouble, long before it's widely accepted the Germans are in trouble with their invasion.
That's just one example of Bill's continued usefulness. Who knows how many more are lost? The true extent of his heroism might never be known. Even so, Bill's relationship with Alfred Rosenberg is almost certainly his greatest achievement. For a decade, he made sure that MI6 knew Rosenberg's every thought and feeling. He made the muddle-headed philosopher into a prism, one through which his handlers could interpret the Nazis' constant internal power struggles. It's no exaggeration to say that even as war became inevitable, Bill De Ropp shaped its course. A path through history that, for Alfred Rosenberg, ended pathetically. May 1945, Berlin.
Rosenberg is in Berlin. He has some extraordinarily close shaves from British bombing, nighttime bombing. And he records it actually in a very sort of visceral manner about driving home and how each time he tries to take a turn with his driver, a house is collapsing into the street. But he gets home and he claims that he is given permission to leave Berlin. I take this with a slight pinch of salt. The truth of the matter is he leaves Berlin and heads towards Flensburg, which is where Dönitz is based, Admiral Dönitz is based, and which of course will become the capital of Germany.
From Flensburg, Rosenberg gets a message to Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, commander of the British ground forces advancing on the German capital.
Look, I'm at Flensburg. I've injured my leg, my ankle. I'm in hospital. Maybe you'd like to come and take my surrender. Unfortunately
for Rosenberg, he has an inflated opinion of his own importance.
I think he thinks this is all going to be some sort of knightly process in which they hand over swords and stuff. But in fact, it's very different, of course. No one gives a stuff about Rosenberg. Field Marshal Montgomery doesn't bother about him. They send a sergeant to arrest Rosenberg. They fly to Luxembourg, where all the senior Nazis are being held in a hotel, the Mondorf Hotel. They fly over Cologne and they can see the whole city completely destroyed. And for the first time, Rosenberg realizes, I think, what he has done.
No, Rosenberg isn't worth Montgomery's time. But he's still a powerful member of Hitler's inner circle. So in at least one respect, the Allies treated him in a manner befitting his rank.
And of course, there was no question he had to hang. And he did indeed go to the gallows, convicted on all 4 charges, and can really have had no complaints at the verdict.
Remember those doodles on Bill De Ropp's pocket atlas? Rosenberg had helped to make them a reality. A brutal carving up of nations and people.
After Bill De Ropp had gone to Switzerland, Rosenberg had been involved in administering Soviet territories and had been indirectly responsible for some of the most appalling atrocities in human history.
Interestingly enough, Rosenberg thought often of his old friend as he awaited the rope.
He asks his defense lawyer to summon Bill De Ropp and Winterbottom as defense witnesses. You can imagine this would have been received with total panic in MI6 head office, who initially deny all knowledge of both men.
Needless to say, his request was refused. But from Switzerland, Bill De Ropp would no doubt have been following Rosenberg's progress through the court at Nuremberg.
I don't think there can be any doubt that he would have had mixed feelings. Probably he wouldn't have defended Rosenberg, whose ideology had caused some of these appalling atrocities. But I think, he also knew that Rosenberg was one of these extraordinary people who, on one level, was quite likable, and on the other level was a monster, which he was. And Winterbottom, too, in his oral testimony at the Imperial War Museum, and there's 25 hours of it, he also talks about his liking for Rosenberg.
It's a story as old as spycraft. And unless you've lived it, it's hard to understand. The agent and his source, the case officer and his agent. These relationships, whatever lies they enfold within them, are always real to some extent.
Even though they may be ideologically or immorally at other ends of the spectrum, there is something there that still creates a bond.
Bill's own end is bittersweet. He was paid out of MI6 with a £500 handshake, only half of what he'd made in a year at the height of his powers.
I think he felt badly treated by Dancy and by the team in Switzerland. He did get his £500 and he did die peacefully as an old man in Herefordshire, working on his languages, to a degree repairing some of his relationships with his family, which inevitably suffer if you're a secret agent. And yet I think part of him must have felt that, he would never have been allowed to see his old case officers again. But, there's something very final.
With that, we close our book on Baron Wilhelm Von De Ropp. But there's another one just waiting to flick open. If you want the full account of Bill's extraordinary life, romances and subterfuge, be sure to pick up a copy of The Spy and the Devil by Tim Willasey-Wilsey, out now. Join us next time for more secret rendezvous with true spies. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you're enjoying this podcast, please click now to give it a 5-star rating or leave a review. Ratings and reviews help people discover the podcast and help us bring you more great stories. And if you have some time, why not forward the podcast to a friend?
It was a catch-up lunch with, I wouldn't say a friend, but I'd say...
Hey folks, get ready for a new season of Blowback, coming Monday, September 22nd. This time around, we're covering the Cold War showdown in Africa.
When apartheid South Africa invades the newly independent nation of Angola, revolutionary Cuba sends its own army to defend its African ally, while the United States backs a warlord whose only goal is power.
Subscribe now at blowback.show and get the entire season when it drops. Ad-free. Blowback.show.
Life's full of big money decisions. Dividend versus growth stocks, tapping home equity, even navigating tariffs.
And for every smart tip out there, there's another one that sounds smart but isn't.
That's where NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast comes in. I'm Sean Piles, a certified financial planner professional.
And I'm Elizabeth Ayola. On NerdWallet Smart Money Podcast, our finance journalists do the homework so you can make confident wealth-building moves.
Whether you're building your portfolio or protecting it, we've got the facts and a little fun along the way.
Follow NerdWallet Smart Money Podcast on your favorite podcast app.
A recurring acquaintance. He's a very entertaining fellow. And he starts telling me about how he's earning really good money working for the Chinese government. So he says, yeah, what I do is I give them parliamentary papers from the table office because it's free there, and I tell them they're classified papers, and they're delighted by that, absolutely thrilled by that. And you say to him, but those are public documents. That's insane. I mean, quite aside from the ethics of it, those are literally available in the parliamentary gift shop, and there's a price on the back of them, isn't there? And he said, oh yes, I've thought of that. The thing is, what I tell them is it's so top secret that in case it's found publicly, what they do is they put a price on it to make it look like it's less important than it is. I just thought this is insane.
True Spies, The Debrief from SPYSCAPE Studios. Search for True Spies wherever you get your podcasts.